Good morning and welcome to the third meeting of the Rural Affairs and Islands Committee in 2026. Before we begin, can we ensure that all electronic devices are switched to silent? Our first item on the agenda is consideration of whether to take item 5 in private. Are we agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. Our next item on the agenda today is an evidence session on the Scottish Budget for 2026 to 2027. And I welcome to the meeting Mairi Goujon, the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands, and her supporting officials. This morning we've got George Burgess, who's the Director of Agriculture and Rural Economy. Brendan Callahan is the Interim Chief Exec from Scottish Forestry. Karen Morley, who's the Head of Agriculture and Rural Economy and Finance, and Ian Wallace, the Interim Director of Marine. So we've allocated around 2 hours for the session, and as always, we've got quite a few questions to get through. If we could try and have succinct questions and answers, and invite the Cabinet Secretary to make an opening statement.
My best on that front, but I just want to thank the committee for inviting me to provide evidence on the 26-27 budget and the allocations that have been made to my portfolio. Now, of course, the draft budget was published last Tuesday, and it is focused on a fiscal programme that will deliver for the people of Scotland, that's sustainable as well as impactful. Now, the Scottish Government, of course, continues to face significant pressures. And that includes a constrained funding settlement from the UK spending review. We have rising costs across public services and demographic trends that increase demand for health and social care. Now, following the UK autumn budget, resource funding is only expected to grow by an average of 1.1% in real terms each year across the forecast period. And for capital funding, the position is even more challenging, with Scotland's capital block grant due to reduce in real terms by 0.3% each year by 29-30. Nevertheless, this budget and the Scottish Spending Review protects and builds on the substantial investments that this government has already delivered. Rural affairs, land reform and islands remains a strategic priority for the government, and this budget will invest over £1.1 billion across 26-27 in the portfolio. Now, we will continue to provide Scotland's farmers, crofters and land managers with the most generous package of direct support in the UK, investing over £660 million to support agriculture. We're continuing to invest in our livestock sector through the Voluntary Coupled Support Scheme and Less Favoured Areas Support Scheme, and we continue to support crofting through £4.4 million for the Crofting Agricultural Grant Scheme and Croft House Grant. And we're also investing £25 million in the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme to directly support action to reduce emissions and enhance nature. We have £26 million of capital funding, which is going to support transformation and reform in Scotland's farming and food production industry. Now, of course, delivering on our climate commitments is a key priority to help meet our legal as well as our moral obligations to future generations and to support sustainable jobs and thriving communities across Scotland. And to ensure our land and forests will continue to help us tackle climate change, protect nature and support green jobs, skills and businesses, we're investing £28 million to restore over 10,000 hectares of peatland and £37 million to create more than 12,000 hectares of woodland. Now, critically, these investments will allow us to meet our climate change plan targets. Our island communities will benefit from a new National Islands Plan with over £7 million to support the Islands programme and our Carbon Neutral Islands project. And £9.3 million will be invested in community-led local development. Now, we continue to target our marine budget towards blue economy outcomes and our responsibilities for the integrated management of Scotland's seas. And funding of £16.6 million for Marine Fund Scotland will be available to support marine businesses as well as coastal communities to deliver innovation and sustainable development across Scotland. Now, this increase in the Marine Fund Scotland includes the first year of the fishing and coastal growth funding, although the approach that has been taken by the UK Government constrains our investment, given Scotland's allocation simply doesn't recognise the size and importance of the fishing sector in Scotland. So my priorities are clear, and I'm committed to ensuring that my portfolio delivers lasting impact for our rural, coastal and island communities and industries. And with that, I'm happy to take questions from the committee.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. As always, you put on a very positive slant, and I think that's something you'll be able to do throughout your time as the Cabinet Secretary. But this budget doesn't build on previous support because it's actually falling. You must be really disappointed because repeatedly, year after year, this is the only portfolio across the whole Scottish Government budget that has fallen year on year. We've seen a 7.8% reduction in cash in real term, in cash terms, and 9.3% reduction in real terms in the 2024-25 budget, and this just repeats that cut. You know, the flagship payment system, the basic payment system that the government are very pleased to continue, we've seen a 23% cut over 5 years in real terms, a cut of 64.5 million since 21-22. So this is not really building on support. This is further cuts to a sector which is expected to do more over the coming years in light of our climate crisis and biodiversity crisis. The basic payment scheme, greening, less favoured area support scheme have all remained constant, the flatlined, which does reflect a significant cut in real terms. So given the rise in costs and the major transformation that agricultural businesses are expected to deliver, how can farmers do more and crofters do more with less?
I think, first of all, I would say, and one thing that I am proud of is our commitment to have maintained our direct support for farmers and crofters, and I think being able to provide that stability has been crucial. I think especially at a time when we've seen those payments essentially fall off a cliff across elsewhere in the UK. Now, of course, an increased budget, and I think there's been calls from ENGOs, when you look at the industry representatives as well, for an increase to the budget. But I think we're in a situation where in the previous UK government, we never saw the Brexit promises materialise about the funding that we should expect to receive from the UK government, which stayed flat. We've also seen that continue and in fact worsen with the change in how the funding is allocated from the UK government to the Scottish government. So yes, we've maintained that at a similar level, but we are also supplementing that with our own funding. And I do think it's important to recognise...
Maintained it though. You talked about maintaining the basic payments, but it's been cut by 23% over the last 5 years.
The overall 600 and, well, if you look at the overall ring fence or baseline allocation that we would have is a £620 million. Now,
which
yes,
hasn't
the
changed
overall numbers
in real terms.
Have stayed the same, and I appreciate exactly what you're saying there about the inflationary impacts of that and what that means in real terms. But again, we've maintained that overall level, but again, it's hard to deliver more when we're not receiving any more from the UK government in the way that we would have done previously.
But Cabinet Secretary, this is about priorities and choice, because almost every other portfolio has seen an increase. This portfolio, your portfolio, is only one that's seen a decrease. So it's not necessarily about the UK government funding formula. It's about the block grant that you get. It's the Scottish Government's priorities. It's how the budget's allocated. But we have seen a year-on-year cut. And again, just to say you've maintained the basic payment scheme is actually not accurate. It has seen a huge 23% cut in real terms over 5 years. So why is the rural sector, given what it's expected to deliver, seen a cut in the face of other portfolios actually seeing a rise in budget? That's got to do with priorities and choice that your government's making. Yeah,
but I would disagree with actually some of the assertions that you've made in relation to that. Now, obviously, when we were members of the EU, the vast majority of the funding that would have flown through to my portfolio, whether that's agricultural payments or you look at our marine sector as well, that's where that money stemmed from. The UK government made commitments at that time that we would see that funding maintained and continue to come through and that we would get our fair share. That has never materialised and has never happened. Now, I also don't think that's fair to say about other portfolios. There have been decreases across other portfolios in the government too. And I also think it's important to remember, though, that in some of those other portfolios, we cannot just look at the overall spend in rural and islands areas through the prism of the rural affairs portfolio, because there is so much wider spend across government that also contributes to that sustainability of our rural and island communities too. And again, we've made that commitment to maintain that direct payments, to maintain that stability, and again is something that we still remain committed to.
Okay, I'm glad you moved on to that. So you're suggesting that other parts of the rural economy get funding from elsewhere. Whilst we're still to see exactly how agricultural support is going to reform in the future, is the government planning to place more emphasis on funding farmers and crofters to deliver the priorities that you've set out previously about climate change, biodiversity loss, to actually counteract the costs to the sector? So are we likely to see, as more agricultural policy change takes place, that there will be increased budget to deliver those policy changes?
I think we've already seen that in recent years, if I'm understanding your question correctly, so please just let me know if I've misinterpreted it. But I think that we have provided funding, I think, essentially to help prepare our farmers and crofters for some of the changes. So when you look at the funding that we provided through the National Test Programme and Preparing for Sustainable Farming, that's provided for the costs of soil analysis, for carbon audits, for animal health and welfare plans, ultimately helping farmers and crofters to get their own baseline for their businesses going forward, supporting them within that. And ultimately, these are measures that we hope will help with the business overall resilience and efficiency too. And there are also other schemes, when you look at some of the conditions that we've added to the Suckler Beef Support Scheme as an example, which hopefully will help with that business efficiency as well. So yes, I mean, we've made no bones about that. When we've had these additional areas of funding or spend, we are looking to target that in relation to climate and nature outcomes. But again, we need to look at what work we can do on climate and nature, because that helps with food production, it helps with overall business resilience too.
Yep, you said additional funding for climate or biodiversity. It's not additional funding, because the pot, the agricultural pot, has decreased significantly in real terms. So all you're actually doing is reallocating money within an ever-decreasing funding pot, but expecting farmers to deliver more. So the pot's got smaller, but the schemes that the farmers have got to get involved in, the climate change, biodiversity, whatever, they're expected to do more for less. Is that likely to continue when we see more agricultural reform, or will there be further funding to help deliver those schemes?
Well, again, I think we are helping farmers and crofters to deliver more. I've talked about the funding that was provided through the National Test Programme for the whole farm plan. But I mean, there are also, when you look out with agriculture necessarily, but you have the changes that we've made to the forestry grant scheme to try and increase the rates to encourage those smaller scale planting that we've seen through some of the really amazing work that's been done through the Integrating Trees Network as an example, to show how the business benefits that come from, well, the wider benefits that come from planting trees on farms for the environment, for animal health and welfare, as well as for wider business too. So we're always looking to these different schemes to see what we can do to encourage more of that, whether that's tree planting or whether it's undertaking some of these important baselining work as well and providing the support for that.
Okay, thank you. Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Commissioner. We've quite rightly been concentrating, I suppose, on the inputs in terms of funding in the budget. I wonder if you could say a bit more about what the budget's priorities are in terms of the, if you like, the experience you want farmers in Scotland to have, and how that experience might diverge from the experience of farmers in England and Wales.
I think ultimately we want to be able to provide some stability, I think, for our farmers and crofters, so they know what to expect. I think through the budget that we provided this year, and I think with a bit of line of sight that we have with the spending review, hopefully we're able to provide some of that clarity as well. And I think through some of the commitments that we've made to maintaining that direct support, to maintaining that support that we know is critical for farmers and crofters, whether that's LFAS or voluntary coupled support as well, not to mention the funding that we provide through our crofting schemes, which I touched on in my opening comments too, through the Crofting Agricultural Grant Scheme, through Croft Housing Grants. We want to make sure we have a thriving rural Scotland. we know that we need to maintain and increase the populations across rural and island areas in Scotland. And I think through the funding that we're providing, through the schemes that we have here, through my own portfolio, as well as more broadly across government as well, whether that's transport, housing, I think all helps add to that.
So finally, Convener, is that a picture that continues to diverge from the experience of farmers in England and Wales?
As far as I'm aware, it is. I mean, I think ultimately we've seen across elsewhere in the UK those direct payments fall off a cliff. And I think that we think it's important to maintain, and we've always felt it was important to maintain that direct support for farmers and crofters, because we recognise the value of food production in Scotland, continuing that while also helping to increase that business resilience, as I say, to help tackle the climate and nature challenges that we face too.
Thank you, Convener.
I just want to pick you up again on your assertion that you're maintaining the basic payment scheme. You're not. The basic payment scheme has been cut by 64.5 million in real terms, and that's out of a pot of 282. It's a 23% cut in 5 years to the basic payment. So it's not being maintained. It's being year on year cuts to that.
I can only reiterate what I've said in previous responses. Now, I appreciate the inflationary impact, but again, it comes back to the fact that we have not seen those increase in allocations from the UK government. And I think when you compare it to the overall spend that they are putting into DEFRA now, which I believe is heading on a downwards trajectory too, again, we've passed on that funding that we receive. We have added our own funding on top of that, on top of the baseline allocation that we get from the UK government, as well as through these other schemes trying to support our farmers and crofters too.
Okay, thank you. Ariane Burgess.
I'd just be interested to get a sense from you how the government's going to be monitoring or is monitoring whether this funding profile is affecting farm viability or the uptake of new schemes. You know, how are you tracking that change in the budget?
Again, I think we always look to monitor across the piece about how any different schemes or programmes are working on the ground and working in practice. But do you mean in relation to some of the newer schemes that we've seen, or the? Yeah,
but also just the change, the change in the budget, the movement of money from one place to another. How are you tracking? Does that have an impact on farm viability on the ground? Do you have a monitoring scheme that kind of tracks your funding pots?
I'll ask George. I don't know if I have any further information on that.
So obviously we have information on the individual schemes and what they funded, who they funded. One of the other sources that we would have is through the regular assessment of farm incomes. Now, obviously, there are a whole lot of factors into that, market forces as well as the government support, but that will give us a picture of, which sectors are doing better than others. But certainly, I think in the next couple of years, a large part of our focus will be on data, both the data availability for government and making sure that the data that is already out there can be given back to farmers in a way that they can actually use it to improve their businesses. My Herd Stats being a prime example of that.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Tim Eagle.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. Before I start, just remind everyone of my register of interest, because I do claim single farm payment and I have been previously in the EEC scheme. Cabinet Secretary, can I just go back to a question the convener was asking a minute ago? You were talking about increases from the UK government. I want to clarify this, because the block grant, my understanding is the block grant to the Scottish Government has increased considerably in cash terms. So it's a hard argument, isn't it, to say, and the agricultural, well, not the agricultural, but the rural funding has been barnetised, so that now comes as part of that overall block grant, is my understanding. So within the context of that, then, it's quite difficult for you to make the argument, is it not, that it's somehow all London's fault, given that actually it's within the remit of the Scottish Government to be able to give as much as they wish to give to the rural portfolio within that wider block grant, which has increased in cash terms? Well,
first of all, I would disagree with that. I think when you're looking at the overall funding that's come through the spending review, I think is I'm sure I'll be corrected by officials if I'm wrong on that, I think it's about maybe 820 million or 840 million over the course of that period, which is about a 1.1% increase in resource terms over that time. And then we're also seeing capital fall. And I'll hand over to George in a moment, I think, who can talk more about the impact of having that funding settlement now come through the Barnett formula as opposed to the way that it worked before. But I do think it's a bit unfair to lay the blame necessarily at the Scottish Government's door when we have funded over and above that baseline allocation. When previously we received that funding from the EU, we were told by the UK Government that they would replace that funding in full. And again, none of those promises ever materialised. And we rely on that funding for the payments that we then are able to provide to our farmers and crofters. But I'll bring George in, who, as I say, will be able to talk a bit more about the impact of the funding settlement and the changes that have been made there.
Thank you. Yes, the UK Government published its spending review back end of last year. It's at a very high level, but we see in that the line for DEFRA going from, I think, 5.0 billion in the current financial year down to 4.9 and eventually down to 4.7 billion over the period of the spending review. That's a total DEFRA rather than particular amounts for agriculture or fisheries or other DEFRA services, but that's the figure that will be used in the Barnett formula calculation. So the result of that is that next year, the Barnett formula consequentials that will have come to the Scottish Government from the DEFRA portfolio are negative. So money has come out of the Scottish bloc as a result of the UK budget changes. And maybe just to pick up on one of the convener's points from earlier, the baselining is baselining in cash terms. It's the 620 million. It's not 620 million uprated by inflation each year. So the baseline is flat in cash terms. It is a real terms reduction.
So just for my own interest then, for clarity, so when the UK government budget comes out, the starting point for Scottish budget negotiations is to look at your equivalent department in England and use that as the baseline for what you will ultimately give in the Scottish budget here in Scotland. Is that what you're saying? Because you're looking at the DEFRA line, you're not looking at the overall context of the budget having risen in cash terms, because it has risen in terms of the entire block grant. That then comes to Scotland, and Scotland has full devolved capacity to do what it likes with that overall package. But you're not looking at that. You're looking at purely at the DEFRA line. So you're just copying effectively what's going on down south.
No. But what's happening on the DEFRA line is certainly part of the overall consideration. So the Scottish Government has made a commitment that on health and social care that the formula consequentials will be passed on in full. Actually, in those areas, to maintain the same sort of percentage increase requires extra funding to be put in from within the block grant. So we're not just looking at the DEFRA line and copying it, but it is certainly part of the consideration. So that the formula consequentials we're getting, as I say, from the DEFRA line are negative. So to make that up, even to get to the a flat cash, as we've done, effectively requires money to be coming from elsewhere into this portfolio.
I guess we're just going to have a difference of opinion on this, because I would have thought that if your priority is to spend on the rural portfolio, then you would just make that happen within the rural portfolio. Can I ask, though, in the context, do you think we would understand the budget more if we'd had the rural support plan that was promised in December?
I don't believe that would be the case, because the budget is the budget. The rural support plan, obviously there are a number of legal commitments in terms of the overall support that we needed to publish within that, but I don't think that would have provided necessarily, I think, the clarity or the detail, or I think any more information than what the members would see through what we've published in the...
But given the changes that are coming up, which you must know in your head, although I don't because I've not seen the rural support plan, you must have looked at what changes you know are going to come up in the next couple of years and on that basis determined what money you would need within the rural portfolio, did you not?
Well, again, I think that's part of the reason for the delay in the rural support plan, which I believe the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity had written to the committee about, was because the budget process had been delayed. And I think we obviously want to be able to provide as much clarity within that document as possible and line of sight about what funding is coming. But I think also when we published the draft, or the basis of what the rural support plan would look like, again, it was going to be largely based on what we already have published in that information through the route map, where we've provided information about when schemes we're expecting to change, or when we're expecting any big changes to come. Well, not any big changes, because of course we're engaging with the industry on all of that, but really trying to provide that line of sight. But again, through the budget and spending review, it was important that I think we received this information so that we're able to populate that, I think, with that further line of sight that I think will be helpful for that document.
I'm looking forward to see what the big changes are, Cabinet Secretary. Do you want to give us a new date, a new promise for when the rural support plan we are going to see it?
Again, I think it's important that we work through the budget process first, but I would expect the plan to come in quite short order after that. No, but again, and I think I mentioned big changes there, but again, all the information that we have is already published. It's already in the route map about when we expect schemes to change. We've made that promise about no cliff edges, and we absolutely stick to that as well. And we've published as much information as possible, I think, to provide that line of sight, to provide that comfort about what potential new schemes could look like within that too. So again, there's no big surprises there.
Moving on, the Scottish Government has obviously put a lot of stock in climate change and the ability of agriculture and in actual fact the entire rural sector to be able to mitigate some of the effects of climate change. But yet the EECS budget, which is a critical agri-environmental scheme that has been going on in many guises for years in Scotland, is just over a third of what it was in 2017-18. Why is that the case?
Well, I think there's a few important things to bear in mind when you look at the EECS line in particular. So basically that line and what we have budgeted for and what we've allocated in the budget for 26-27, it covers the previous year's contracts because they run on a 5-year basis. So we have the funding there to provide for those previous contracts, but we also have enough funding there that will allow all the approved projects through the most recent round of EECS in 2025 to approve those projects too. So it's a demand-led scheme, so you're not necessarily comparing like with like. So we're able to fund everything, all the contracts previously, as well as any new contracts that are entered into through the success of the 2025 round. So by its very nature, that line is going to fluctuate from year to year, depending on what the demand is. Now, of course, in previous years of EECS funding, we have had to restrict some of those rounds in terms of the items that are available, just because of the capital that was available at that time. We did expand that slightly in 2025, from what I remember, and we're also looking to see what improvements we could potentially make for 2026 or whether we could expand that further. So again, that is a line that I think could expect to change in future years, but I think it's just important to remember that it is a demand-led scheme too, which is why we see those fluctuations. I
want to just quickly, if we've got time, get into a little bit more detail on that, because I think it's good to understand. But can I just get the top-line question first, I guess, is do you still believe in the EECS scheme? You still see the agri-environmental scheme as value for money and something that we should be encouraging farmers to join?
Absolutely, yes.
Yes. So can I just ask then, what impact, because you say demand-led, so the fact it's gone down, you know, at its height, what percentage of farmers in Scotland would have been in an agri-environmental scheme, and where are we now? Can you give us a picture of that?
To be honest, I don't have that information to hand. I don't know if George has it, but I'd be happy to follow up with that information to look at in terms of scheme claimants. Now, again, in previous years where we've had to pause a scheme or not, again, reduce the options, of course, I think we would expect to see less claimants then. But I think, given the importance that we do place on EECS, that's why we're looking at the improvements to 2026 to see, well, what else can we do? What other options can we look at within that? Because obviously it's a scheme we want people to apply to. But for those specific information, I'd be happy to follow up with the committee.
Okay, I mean, if you could, I think that would be really valuable, because actually, if you know, at its height, 75% of Scottish farmers and crofters were included in the scheme, but now we find that's at 25%. I myself am not in it anymore. I found it too cumbersome, and actually it just didn't seem worth my while anymore doing, albeit I actually do it for free now because I carry on the same measures, I just don't get paid to do it. But it would be interesting, I think, for the committee to know actually what the impact on the ground is of that reduction in scheme. I accept the point actually that it might be demand-led, but I guess then the question is, if demand isn't there that's sustaining the budget, what's the question? What's going on there?
But if I could just come in, I think on the quick point you've made there about it being cumbersome, though, because I think these are parts of that's where we've been engaging with stakeholders over the course of the past year to look at, well, how do we make improvements? How do we make it less cumbersome for people? I think that's the kind of thing that we're looking at, because I think it can deliver so much. I think it's been one of the key delivery mechanisms for the climate, whether that's tackling emissions or looking at nature restoration as well. So we do want to make sure that we are making those improvements where possible, and I think trying to address some of the challenges you've identified.
And the final question is, I think just looking towards the future, obviously Tier 3 is going to be the new equivalent, whatever that looks like in terms of agriculture funding. Are you expecting that same sort of demand-led activity? You expect that budget to ebb and flow, do you, in terms of that overall funding as that new scheme, as whatever Tier 3 looks like in the future comes into effect?
Well, we've made that commitment about, I think, the overall split of what funding should look like, about the 70-30, so about 70% of that funding being in Tiers 1 and 2 and 30% being in Tiers 3 and 4. And I think by its nature, that Tier 3 is envisaged to be, it's an elective scheme, so ones that people would then look to apply into. It's about that landscape scale restoration. I think there are some other projects that we're looking at and piloting, and Nature Scott has been doing some work for us on that wider landscape scale piece. So I think there could well be other schemes that may be possible to look at in future. So I don't think it's necessarily the case of saying, right, OK, that budget is going to remain static, because that could well change over time too. And again, looking at some of these other new schemes that could come into play.
I guess one final question. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that given climate change plans, given the biodiversity targets for the new Natural Environment Bill that might get passed next week, you would presumably think that we would be sitting on this committee expecting that line to go up, because the demands on farmers are getting greater, because actually you're looking for them to do, farmers and crofters, you're looking for them to do more. But actually that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing that demand, that overall budget in that area of agri-environment dropping, whereas I would have been expecting it to increase. Does that make sense?
I think, well, if you look at that in terms of the aches, and as you say, as you were pointing out, I can't remember which figures you were basing it on initially. It looks like it's a fault. Again, it's hard to, because it's a demand-led, as hopefully I've been able to explain. But as I say, that could well change over time. Okay. Sorry, I don't have been able to explain that fully, but I think we're not necessarily comparing like with like, because as I've explained with aches and how that operates. And that'll be the key mechanism through which we would look to deliver Tier 3 until we get the future framework fully operational.
Okay. Thank you, Convener.
Just in the back of some of your responses, Cabinet Secretary, Tim Eagle touched on the rural support plan, and you rightly referred to the Minister's letter to say that the rural support plan will be published as soon as possible, but that would take into consideration the budget process. But at the moment, we've got a budget which is more or less business as usual. Nothing really has changed. We're working with the same amount of money. But there is an expectation that the rural support plan will deliver some new policy frameworks, potentially some new schemes, whatever. Are you expecting those new schemes or payments or whatever to come out of the budget that's in front of us? Or are you expecting there to be additional funding to deliver some of the new policies and schemes in the rural support plan when it's published?
Again, it's not possible for me to speak with any detail about the new schemes. And I would just come back to some of the points that I'd made about the draft of the rural support plan that we'd published. Again, it will be the first iteration of a plan. And I think given the period of transition that we're in, I can imagine there could well be updates to that plan once we have more clarity and once some more work's been done. But of course, as I've said before, and as I think the information we've already published, we have published a lot of that information, the agricultural reform route map, which sets out the overall direction when we could expect schemes to change or transition. So, of course, the information that we'd have in the rural support plan would build on that. And as I say, hopefully with the information that we've published through the budget and having a bit of line of sight through the spending review, we're able to provide a bit more information.
Okay, thanks. Ariane Burgess.
Cabinet Secretary, you said that the AIC scheme is demand-led, and that you're also making improvements for people to access it. So I just wonder, is there a cap to that demand in the budget? Like if a lot of people came, so if suddenly there was like lots of people that realised climate change is really with us and they're seeing the flooding and so on and so forth, and they wanted to access it, is there a cap on the amount of money in that budget?
Again, that would be considerations for next year's budget, because we haven't opened the 2026 round,
okay.
So we'd be considered at that time.
Right. So you see what people apply for, and then you put money in the budget, and then they get it the following year.
So as I say, so for what we have in the budget for 26-27 covers previous year's contracts, as well as it means we're able to award all the successful applications through the round in 2025.
Could you conceive of there ever being a need to be a cap on it if there was such a high level of demand?
Again, it's something that in previous years we have had to look at closely, or we've ended up restricting rounds or what's available for support purely because we're trying to focus it on the measures that we believe are going to do most for climate and nature, because it was quite expansive. It funded quite a lot of different areas, which I know some people would like to see the return of. But I think because we have had less capital available, we had to target that as best as we could. So again, it's not possible for me to predict necessarily what's going to happen next year once we open this round. We could well see more applications because, as I say, we're trying to make improvements to the scheme. But as I say, we've certainly got enough in this financial year to cover the most recent round of applications.
Thanks.
Evelyn Tweed.
Convener, and good morning, Cabinet Secretary and officials. Thanks for your answers so far. I just want to dig into a couple of the budget headings. Cabinet Secretary, can you highlight for the committee what the Agricultural Modernisation Fund will fund? What is that actually going to do?
Oh, the fund that we've set aside in relation to that is the £26 million, and that's going to be capital funding. But again, so this was similar funding that was introduced last year, the £20 million. So some of the funding last year was used for the Future Farming Investment Scheme, and ended up, I think, all of that funding being utilised fully for that. So we haven't set out how we're going to utilise all of that funding yet, but we've made broad commitments about it, again, ensuring that we're equipping farmers and crofters to, as I mentioned previously, and as we said last year in relation to the capital grant scheme, to tackle climate and nature challenges, but also for our food production and our food processing sector as well. So again, those are the overall outlines of what we're intending to use with that funding. But I would say, I think one element of it that has just recently launched, though, and that I'd announced last year that is being used by £1 million of that funding is being used for, is for the Agritourism Investment Scheme. So I'd announced that at the Agritourism Conference in November last year, and that's £1 million of that funding will be allocated for the Agritourism Investment Scheme, and that just opened this week.
Thanks. Can you also tell us more about the Agricultural Reform Programme? And I believe that's a budget of £7 million?
Yes, that's right. So the Agricultural Reform Programme has an allocation of £7 million against it this year. So I think we have about £5 million against the resource for that, £2 million capital. And ultimately, that's to help us deliver the new capabilities that we need for the Agricultural Reform Programme going forward. So, and it's going to help us deliver the future operating model that we need to deliver the new agricultural framework for support. So that work is going to happen in phases. Each phase will have its own business case attached to it. But the first phase of that work, and where the capital is being allocated this year, is to really invest in our data capability system. So that just really helps us look at what data we're gathering, how we best monitor the outcomes. But George, I don't know if there's anything further you would want to add to that, or if that's broadly covered it in terms of the future operating model.
I think, Cabinet Secretary, you've largely covered it. One of the areas we're looking at in that is Earth observation. So a number of other countries have moved to increasing use of satellite data. So we've already had a small pilot in that. We're looking to expand that, and that potentially can reduce the operating costs for government of doing our work, but also looking at, as I mentioned earlier, packaging up data and information and providing it back to farmers to better support them.
Okay, thank you.
Ariane Burgess.
I just wanted to come back to the Modernisation Fund, and you explained a little bit that the money goes towards food processing, £1 million fund for agritourism, but I feel like I would like to understand better what are we modernising? What's the Modernisation Fund?
Again, we haven't announced the details of those schemes, so it's not possible for me to say definitively, other than the broad lines that we've set out about how we intend to utilise that so far. Again, similarly with what we set out in relation to the Future Farming Investment Scheme last year, those similar kind of outcomes. And we also know that there's been calls for our food processing sector to help invest in businesses there. We used to, of course, have the Food Processing Marketing and Cooperation Grant Scheme, which I know was valued by industry, which we haven't been able to run for the past few years because of the lack of capital that we've had. So again, it's these kind of areas that we'd be looking at that investment.
Okay, and so you said you haven't announced it, but what are the delivery mechanisms going to be for that fund and the timelines of that announcement?
I will make committee aware as soon as we've established a firm position on what those schemes are going to look like. Again, we've been focused on the budget process at the moment and ensuring that we have those overall monies there, but we will be setting out more detail, I'm sure, quite soon in relation to what any potential schemes are going to look like. And I'll well write to the committee with that information.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that, because I think it is important to understand, given that the budgets are going up and down and from one budget to another, it's not particularly clear just how much budget there's been overall. So if you could set out, and I'm not expecting you to do it now, but maybe in writing, what the cumulative spend on the transformation, agricultural transformation and the agriculture reform programme has been since 2021, when they were first announced, just to give us an idea of what that budget actually has been, because it's not particularly clear in the budget papers that we've got.
I appreciate that from the figures, but I'm happy to follow up with the committee with that information.
Thanks, appreciate that. Emma Harper.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary, and to the officials. There's 1.3 million that's being invested in skills for regenerative and sustainable farming and food production. Are you able to tell us what this funding will deliver in practice?
Again, I think we recognise the importance of investing in the skills of our farmers and crofters. We have a number of different funds where we try and do that at the moment, and this will really complement, I think, the schemes that we have in place at the moment. Now, we don't have an established scheme right now, but we want to make sure we work with stakeholders and others to make sure that we deliver a scheme that works for farmers. And I would say that I know that this project was a particular request, I think, from the Greens, and I know that Ariane Burgess in particular has done a lot of work in relation to this, and we've had previous discussions in relation to these schemes. So I see it as very much complementary to the funding that we're investing in skills for farming and food production. So again, we need to undertake that engagement with stakeholders and make sure we deliver a scheme that works for farmers and crofters.
And there's other funding streams out there, right? On Friday, I visited the Dairy Nexus at Barney College, and £8 million has been given to Barney at Parkgate, 4 million from UK government, 4 million from Scottish government, and I heard lots of like really good innovation and skills that's taking place as part of the digital dairy chain. So that's funding that's happening as far as like innovation as well. And then the Farm Advisory Service is another route of how we support farmers and advice. Can you talk a little bit about other funding streams, opportunities that there are out there as well?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, because I think it's not always apparent, I think, from some of the budget lines that we have that can be quite unhelpfully described, that don't necessarily outline all the detail or all the schemes that run within them. So I think one of the key lines in the budget that I think delivers as a whole on the skills piece that you're talking about, one of the key lines is the business development line that you'll see within the budget, which has had an increase on the previous year. And it's through that line that we fund the Farming Advisory Service. There's the funding for new entrants in the next generation. There's the funding for the pre-apprenticeship programme that we run through that as well. And again, through the new entrants in next generation, some of the funding that's earmarked for that has been used for the practical training funds that we know have been really well utilised, and I think quite broadly welcomed by the sector as well. But I think even looking beyond what's in the business development line, and sorry, I forgot to also mention the Monitor Farm Network and Knowledge Transfer and Innovation Fund. They've been really critical, I think, for that peer-to-peer learning, which we know is so important, and that I think came out really strongly in the evidence that we heard through the passage of the ARC Act as well. We have the Knowledge Transfer and Innovation Fund as part of that. But if that's looking at the business development line, but there are other lines across the budget, again, where it may not appear so apparent, but where funding is also used for that skills piece. There's the funding that we provide to Lantra, so that's £600,000. They do some incredible work, and they had led the work that we were doing on the land-based learning review piece as well, and we're committed to still implementing the recommendations that came out from that. We have funding for women in agriculture, and I know that some of that funding has also been used for a practical training fund for women and girls. And even then, more broadly, if you look at some of the funding that we have available through the food and drink budget, now, again, that's more looking at the education piece, but it's the funding that we provide through those lines for the likes of RET. We have the Food for Life scheme, as well as other areas there that are looking at food education and skills. And that's also the Food for Thought Fund, as well as being another one through there. So it's quite hard because it seems like it's a bit all over the place when you consider the budget lines. But I think just to draw on, I hope that's helpful, and I think outlining just some of the other schemes that are available and that we're delivering.
Okay, just a final question. You mentioned women in agriculture. There's also, I think, Digital Dairy Chain are funding women in dairy as well. And I think, is there some money that has come from the Scottish Government to support the Women in Dairy network as well?
I think I would have to look at that. I don't know off the top of my head if that has come from our budget, but George, I don't know if you would know that information. No, but again, we can follow that up and happy to confirm that.
Thanks.
Jess.
My question got covered.
Okay, thank you. Alistair Allen.
Thank you, Convener. The budget, as you're aware, includes a 16.1% increase in the Crofting Commission. I wonder, can you say a bit more about how that's intended to be spent? Is it intended to be spent on things related to the new Crofting Bill, or is it intended to be used to implement the Commission's existing powers and get through a backlog of work?
There is, so I think first of all, I think the Commission has been doing really good work to reduce the backlog there. But the overall uplift that we've seen in funding for the Commission is really just to broadly cover a couple of different areas. I think one key area is what you've talked about. I think the measures that are proposed through the new Crofting and Agriculture Bill, and to ensure that the Crofting Commission can fully deliver on that. But we also have funding available to replace the Crofted Information System, and that's really to ensure that the Crofting Commission have a modern and flexible system that can then adapt to their emerging needs going forward. So I hope that's helpful in highlighting just how some of that funding is intended to be utilised.
Finally, Convener, one of the things that's been a constant theme, as you're aware, is the appetite for regulation within the Crofting community, and particularly in dealing with enforcing the duties that crofters have, not least to work their land, and to allow new entrants in as a result of that. So is it your hope that this welcome significant increase for the Crofting Commission will actually result in more enforcement?
Absolutely. As I touched on, I think in my initial response, I think the Commission has made really good strides in improving its regulatory performance, but I think hopefully with the funding that's available now, and I think they have already, if I'm right, been directing resource specifically to look at that enforcement, but I think that hopefully with the new funding that's been allocated to the Commission, they are fully resourced to be able to deliver on the provisions that are going to be in the new bill, as well as then, like I say, just continue to improve their performance and ensure that they are undertaking that enforcement too.
Thank you, Convener.
Convener, the Crofting housing grant scheme is being cut by £2.1 million, and that looks like it is repayment of loans that is coming out of the budget. Is that because there are no loans being repaid and that figure has fallen, or is it that that money is going elsewhere, because it's quite a big cut in that budget?
So I'll hand over to officials who will be able to give a bit more information about the loan element of that. But I think in relation to, you're right, it looks like a significant cut to the Croft Housing Grant. But again, this is a demand-led scheme, and what we have outlined in the budget we expect is what is going to meet the demand over the coming year. And this is a scheme that is open through the year, and it reflects the level of applications that we've been receiving. One thing I would say, though, is that we did make some, I think, really positive changes to the Croft House Grant scheme. I think that was just within the last couple of years, looking to increase uptake of the scheme. So we increased the grant rates that were available, I think from 40 to 60%. We increased, we added to the provisions that could be funded. So we were looking at funding energy efficiency as well as the grants just for housing too. So we have tried to look at what we can do to make that scheme work a bit better. But again, what we have in the budget is what is expected to meet the level of demand that exists for the scheme at the moment. But I'll hand over to George, who may have more information in relation to the loan element.
Yeah, Ms Grant, you're correct. There is a loan repayment of loan element in this, but I think that's 0.2 million, so relatively small. The main change, as the Cabinet Secretary has said, is a lower capital allocation, but that is based on meeting the demand that we have seen in recent years. We have not had to turn away any good application for this scheme, and I think we would want to continue that being the case. It's quite a difficult one to budget for, because once the grant is allocated, the crofters actually then have an extended period. It's not limited to the 1 year, so we're having to do some complicated calculations here to try to make sure we've got the right money in the right year to meet the scheme. There may be wider questions, despite the point that the Cabinet Secretary has made about increasing the amount that's available and increasing the flexibility, as to whether there are still reasons why crofters are not wanting to come forward for this scheme. We're all aware of the increase in construction costs in the economy more generally. So I think it's something that we probably need to look at, because we know that there are improvements needed to the croft house stock around the country. This is a good mechanism to help crofters to achieve that, and I think we would all like to see greater uptake of the scheme. And were there to be a greater uptake, then I think we would be doing all that we can to look at budgets in year and make sure that we can meet the commitments we've already made.
I would welcome a review of the scheme, because people are coming to me saying that they don't qualify. It's really restrictive. And if you take into account that people's salaries in the Crofton communities, people are maybe working several different jobs, a bank wouldn't consider them, but because their income comes to a level, then they don't get the grant. So it really needs looked at, given we've got a housing crisis in the Crofton counties. This is a real way that we could change it, and it's quite disappointing to see that you estimate that the demand for this is falling further when we know the demand is increasing.
I agree with you in many ways, and I think in what you've said there, and I think if any particular ideas, or if we want to have a follow-up discussion in relation to that, I'm more than happy, either myself or the Minister, Jim Fairley, would be happy to engage in that, because I think, again, we tried to make improvements previously, recognising, as George had outlined, some of the increase in costs, because you're absolutely right. I think for what is a small budget in the grand scheme of things, I think it's one of those ones that has a big impact. It's so important, as you've rightly outlined, for retaining populations in rural and island areas in Scotland. So we want to make sure that that's fully utilised. So again, any particular ask you have, or if you think there are areas we need to consider, I'm happy to have that discussion with yourself and any others who are interested, and to have then that wider engagement with stakeholders too, to see what further improvements can be made.
Thank you. Just a very quick question. The £26 million of capital funding for the Agriculture Modernisation Fund, is that the final instalment of the money that was taken from the agricultural budget during the emergency budget process a few years ago? Yes. And is the total budget line reflective of that additional money, or actually is the 26 million that was put back in, is it an additional 26 million, or is it just keeping the budget the same? Because it's difficult to work out whether that was actually really returned. Yes, because these are new schemes. Okay, thank you. And very finally, on the agricultural side of things, the budget has drawn quite a bit of criticism from the major stakeholders. NFUS have warned that the budget essentially flatlines vital support payments, results in a real terms decline. criticised the lack of multi-year funding, saying that it consigns industry to an annual battle over future support. Scottish Land and Estates say businesses have been left with little confidence. Countryside Alliance, disappointing the funding has been cut when every aspect of farming and land management costs are increasing year on year. So it doesn't sound very positive. So finally on the agricultural side of things, what positive message have you got to farmers and land managers that actually this government does care about rural Scotland in light of this budget?
Well, I think one thing I would want to say is I would reiterate. Now, I completely understand the frustrations that have been expressed by some stakeholders. Again, like many others, I wish we weren't in the position we were in with our budget. I wish we had that multi-year funding available that we used to have when we were members of the EU. It's easier for the government to plan. It's easier for our stakeholders, for our farmers and crofters to plan for the future as well. But unfortunately, we've been caught in this annual cycle of budgets. And again, while we've had the spending review, a spending review isn't a multi-annual budget. It's just potentially a line of sight for the future. And we've always said we would want to provide, if we were in a position to be able to commit to that, then that is absolutely what we would do. But again, I would just reiterate the commitments that we've made already to the sector, maintaining that direct support. It is not within anybody's best interest for there to be any cliff edges in terms of support payments that they can expect, any scheme changes. We're committed to work with the industry as we move forward in terms of agricultural reform. And I hope through the additional investments that we're making, we touched on the £26 million through the Agriculture Modernisation Fund, that shows our continued investment and our continued commitment to the sector.
OK, we'll not argue about the 26 million which was taken out of the budget in the first place. So it's not really additional funding, it's money that was taken out previously. However, we will now move on to the forestry budget. I've got a question from Tim Eagle.
On forestry then, so can you explain the large reduction in Forestry and Land Scotland's capital budget?
Yes. Now, in relation to Forestry and Land Scotland, obviously the funding and the income that they receive from the government is one element of the overall income of the organisation. And the cut has largely come to the capital funding that's available for Forestry and Land Scotland. Now, I think they would have used and would normally use that capital for their own land acquisition and for tree planting. But again, when we're constrained in capital terms and we're trying to think about how we can best utilise that capital, that's where the funding, we've allocated more funding through the forestry grant scheme, because in terms of the hectares of tree planting that we can deliver for the money that's spent, most of that value comes from the forestry grant scheme, as opposed to sitting with Forestry and Land Scotland, where the costs are more expensive to plant trees on the public estate.
So that money has been transferred from Forestry and Land Scotland to Scottish Forestry?
Well, again, when we're looking at the overall capital budgets, it's not necessarily it's been taken from Forestry and Land Scotland and given to Scottish Forestry, but we have decided to allocate our capital and prioritise putting the capital into the forestry grant scheme for one. We've also got the funding that we put in for peatland too, because, again, it will constrain the amount of trees that Forestry and Land Scotland can plant on their own estate because of the lack of capital funding. But again, it's more expensive for Forestry and Land Scotland to deliver that woodland creation than it is to deliver it through the forestry grant scheme. OK.
But in terms of the raw money behind this, is the money the same or less than what it was? Because it looks to me like it's down by about 5 million or so than what it was last year.
Yes, there has been a capital cut to Forestry and Land Scotland. As I say, because we're prioritising where the capital's delivered, and that's why it's been prioritised. Well, the forestry grant scheme has been a priority because, again, we're able to deliver more through the forestry grant scheme, whereas Forestry and Land Scotland, it costs them more essentially to plant trees on their own land.
But planting trees is still a big priority for the government, is it not?
Yes, it is, of course. But again, through the additional funding that we've put in through the forestry grant scheme this year, ultimately that's what's going to help deliver the planting targets that we have for the coming year and that are set out in the climate change plan.
OK, so you're satisfied that the amount of capital within that budget will meet the obligations under the climate change plan once it goes through? Yes, but that, if I remember rightly, was it last year you were here, and I think you were bitterly disappointed by the quite significant cut, which undermined the sector and caused quite a bit of concern. If I'm right, by my calculations, or the calculations we've been given actually, that is still something like 18.5 million less than in 23-24. So the overall budget is still significantly down on what you had predicted a few years ago.
Well, on the again, it was the cut that had taken place, I think, in 24-25 that had been significant. Again, we'd invested more in the woodland creation over the last year, but again, we also recognise that it is going to take a bit time again to hopefully ramp up the rate of planting that we hope to see and that we've set out within the climate change plan as well. But again, the budget that we have allocated to woodland creation in this year's budget will help us reach the targets that we've set out in the climate change plan.
Okay, just one more question though, because you say ramp up. My understanding is the industry was already ramped up and ready to go, and then that sort of massive collapse happened in 24-25. We've had another business. We met a business up in my neck of the woods recently that has just gone out of business, actually in part because of that change in budget. So you're confident then that the industry is ramping up again to that, because the budget, the underlying budget, has had a significant impact on tree planting in Scotland, is it not?
Again, there's no getting away from that. I think I've been pretty open and upfront with the committee in previous years as well when I've appeared about the impact of that cut. I mean, there's no getting around it, and I think I heard quite clearly from industry the impact that that had on confidence in planting levels, which is why we've been keen to show that investment and continue to invest to show the trajectory going forward. So again, what we have in the budget this year is an increase on last year to help us get back up to some of the planting rates that we've seen. Because I think at the highest level, we saw about 15,000 hectares planted. And again, I think we have a target of about 10,000 this year, looking to get to 12,000 hectares next year with the funding that we have available. So, and ultimately, I believe that's what's going to help us get there. I mean, Brendan, I don't know if there's anything further you would want to add in relation to that, or if I've broadly covered it.
You've covered it.
Okay.
Harper.
I'm not sure. I think my question was covered, convener.
Okay, I've just got a quick one. Comfor have repeatedly said that the government needed to reverse the significant reductions in previous budgets, suggested we needed about 70 million in 26-27, and that would have to rise to closer to 100 million by the end of the next session. And what we've got, the funding at the moment really only pays for about 10,000 hectares. That's 2,000 hectares short. What the target is to try and meet our climate and nature objectives. So why hasn't the government listened and to the forestry sector, and given again the climate change plan, which is supposed to enable Scotland to meet its climate and planting targets, why have we not seen an increase in forestry funding to repair the damage that's been done in confidence, but also give confidence for a long-term industry in the future?
There's a few points in that, and I'm sure, again, Brendan will no doubt correct me if I'm wrong in any of my assessment of this. Now, there's no point in us putting a massive lump sum in the budget if we don't believe that that can be spent. And the allocation that's in the budget for woodland creation for the coming year will ultimately help us deliver our targets. So, yes, you could have put more capital in there. Could that then mean that it doesn't necessarily translate to a bigger capital budget? You're going to get all of that delivered in that year, because recognising the cut that had taken place, things will take time to develop and again to ramp back up to where we had been. So again, that is part of this process. So we have the investment, we believe, to deliver the hectares and the targets that we have set out in the climate change plan. So again, I hope that that's helpful in terms of an explanation, but again, I don't know if there's anything you would want to add, supplement with that.
I think the only thing further to say is that we don't know the figures Confor used. I mean, they've obviously seen the climate change plan, so they know that the target for the next year is 12,000, but we don't know their assumptions on grant rates and costs. The figure is actually a mix of some projects that are quite expensive. So smaller schemes on crofts are very expensive because of the fencing costs and the extra challenges of establishing trees. So there's a small number of them in the mix. We've got farmer schemes which are somewhere in the middle. We've got larger scale schemes which are a little bit cheaper per hectare because of fencing. But what we're increasingly blending in, and we've been pushed by the committee on this in the past, the schemes delivered by natural regeneration, and how we're delivering them is we're paying for deer management in advance, getting the deer numbers down on estates where they're moving that direction. And then when the natural regeneration comes, it's a much cheaper, both for landowner and for Scottish Government. So as they blend in, we're able to operate with, we're able to basically maintain or maybe even reduce the average cost of woodland creation through the grant. I think Confor may be including estimates of just a more conventional mix of grant rates, not assuming the natural generation element, which is bringing the cost down a bit for us.
Okay, that takes us nicely on to the next question from Ariane Burgess.
Thanks, Convener. Yes, Brendan, you mentioned deer management. That's going to be my question, Cabinet Secretary. In light of the Natural Environment Bill and the expectations around effective deer management, are you satisfied that the Forestry and Land Scotland's funding is sufficient to manage deer effectively on the National Forestry estate?
I think certainly what I've heard from FLS is that they're not expecting any additional budget pressure from the measures that are in the bill. So I believe that they're quite confident in that.
Okay. And then just following on from that, in the Level 4 budget workbook, the Natural Resources line 177, it shows a very steep reduction. It looks like close to 75% cut in the capital allocation compared with last year. And the explanation, under the explanation of this significant changes column, says it's not been possible to allocate capital funding from the Rural Affairs, Land Reform and Islands portfolio, 26 to 27. The previously funded Atlantic Rainforest Restoration will now be in scope of the Nature Restoration Fund, funded through the Climate Action and Energy portfolio. So in speaking with stakeholders, I think they are kind of puzzled that this fund even existed. So just concerned that there was a fund that could have been allocated, and stakeholders are doing crucial work around deer management and rhododendron. I can't think of a better term than bashing, rhododendron eradication. That work gets done, and then this fund gets changed and cut. And applying to the Nature Restoration Fund is a whole different. It doesn't really fit the need of those projects. And apparently there's 11 projects in the rainforest space right now that really could do with that kind of funding that seems to have been disappeared.
Yeah, I think there's a few things in relation to that. And I mean, as you'll have read in the documents, yes, there has been a reduction to the capital budget. And again, it's because we are under pressure in relation to capital. So we are trying to allocate that as best we can. There had been funding within that in the previous year, potentially 2 years. Again, we didn't know if that funding would be recurring, and I think that had always been made clear at the start. But largely the funding that we'd allocated for the rainforest restoration, and I absolutely appreciate how important that work is, was largely for Forestry and Land Scotland. So I think there are a variety of different pieces of work that are done by various different stakeholders in relation to protecting the Atlantic rainforest. We do have other schemes that are available. So I think through the Forestry Grant Scheme, there's funding available, but of course that would be for private landowners to access in relation to rainforest restoration. We have the Nature Restoration Fund from the Climate Action portfolio, which has been funding that, and I think more of the third sector organisations. But the funding that we had specifically in this portfolio had been for Forestry and Land Scotland and maintaining the rainforest work on their own estate. So again, recognising that that has been really important work. It is just absolutely, as you've outlined, it's been for deer control and rhododendron control as well. We want to make sure that the good work done so far isn't undone, but that's where we're currently looking at what other options may exist, how we can best utilise budgets to make sure that we are maintaining, I think, some of the progress that we've made in relation to that.
Okay, so that's good to get clarity that it's FLS forestry estate, but I just want to kind of back up your point that if you've done that work and then it's harder to keep doing that work, and I'm aware that we've been at this for years and we've stopped and started, and it's not I think maybe the new realisation is that we have a rainforest that is going to really help us meet some of our climate targets. Whereas maybe in the past we were just looking at just rhododendron eradication or bringing the deer numbers down. Now we understand the context that we're working in, and that is to kind of defragment these precious parts of rainforest. So I just wonder if you you know, if we need to be looking at that budget, I mean, you're saying you're trying to find them, gestures, trying to find that money somewhere else to keep that work going, and that you recognise it is. Do you feel confident that you can find that?
Again, I'm not at a stage to be able to outline that today or to give that firm commitment, but we just want to emphasise we recognise how important that work is. Obviously, I have regular engagement with Comfor and the Woodland Trust, and that was one of their key asks through the budget process was recognising how important our rainforests are. So I think, it does. One key thing for me is, I want to make sure we're not losing any of the progress we've made. So I am keen to see, well, is there any way through this that we can find to at least help progress that? So again, I'm more than happy to follow up with any solutions if we do find them, but just to let you know, it's not as if the budget has been cut and it's fallen off the radar. We are trying to see what we can do within the allocations.
Thank you.
It's clear that the Forest and Land Scotland budget has had a 87.6% cut, which is around 11 million. And I know we've explained that some of that budget will go to Scottish Forestry, but that's only 5.6 million. We've heard that. My concern is, what assessment have you made about the impact of the significant cut in Forest and Land Scotland's budget on the likes of rural tourism assets, the Seven Stains, Dark Sky Park in my constituency, and the wider biking network and public access that over the last few years has seen or appeared to have seen a dramatic decline in focus. We've seen mountain bike networks remain closed after storms. There's been very little in the Dark Sky. So how can you give assurances that you have taken into consideration and assessed the impact on the national forest as a asset for tourism and public access?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that this isn't the sole funding that's available to Forestry and Land Scotland, because we provide an element of the funding to Forestry and Land Scotland, but they also have income from timber, from renewables, from other areas as well. Now, again, that has been a significant capital allocation cut from the portfolio to Forestry and Land Scotland. But as I outlined, I hope and was clear in some of my earlier responses, that directly relates to their ability to acquire land and plant trees on the public estate. So therefore, now I'm not saying that Forestry and Land Scotland is by any means clear of challenges, because broadly across the public sector, we're looking at how we can deliver more efficiently and look to save on costs as much as possible. But again, that is the key area that's impacted by the cut to the capital allocation, which is the most significant element.
But was there any assessment done on the impact on the tourism asset or public access to the national forests?
Again, we engage with the public agencies and with Forestry and Land Scotland when we're having budget discussions, and I'm not aware, and I haven't been made aware that there would be an impact on those wider services, and the only impact would be on their ability to acquire land and plant trees.
Okay, thanks very much.
Oh, sorry, Brendan, would you like to come in?
Yeah, I mean, just to add a little bit of detail here, as CABSEC says, the majority of the income, the majority of the operating costs for Forest and Land Scotland are actually net covered by their trading, so timber income and renewables are the main ones, but also some recreation and estate income. And last year that was £150 million to put in the context of the capital. The resource contribution and the Scottish Government makes broadly to Forest and Land Scotland broadly equates to the net operating costs for recreation and conservation and heritage. So if you were to look at their accounts, you can see they do raise some income in those areas from recreation, car parking and events and the like. But the net operating cost is broadly about 15 million. So it costs them about 15 million more to run their tourism, recreation, there are ancient monuments and attractions of that nature, and that's what the Scottish Government contribution pitches at. So all the things like the deer management, the building of roads, the felling, the employment of staff is covered by the trading effort of the estate. Now they, as CABSEC says, they're very focused on optimising that and reducing costs and doing that efficiently. And it doesn't mean that they don't have challenges in there, but that's the challenge that they take. And obviously they can, in good years, they can bank money and carry over surpluses to cover if timber prices go down or there isn't the demand. They've just had a good year. because of both, particularly because of energy prices, but they've also optimised on timber harvesting last year.
Okay, thank you. I'm minded to have a 10-minute break between these different portfolios, so I suspend the meeting for 10 minutes. Welcome back, and we'll continue our budget scrutiny and this time moving to the Marine Directorate. Cabinet Secretary, this shows once again a real times decrease in funding, which means we've now seen a third consecutive year a decrease in the Marine Directorate budget. The budget also commits to replacing 2 protection and research vessels, along with a programme of fisheries modernisation. So how can that be achieved when we see that reduction in budget?
Well, I think first of all, taking into account what you've said on when we're looking at the new vessels, so the one marine protection vessel and the science vessel, there's actually been £150 million that's been identified for that over the next 4 years for delivery of those. But I think it's important to remember that that's going to be funded through the capital allocation rather than necessarily through the Marine Directorate operations budget. So funding has been identified out with that. I would also say that there has been a resource increase on the AWR position from last year as well of £0.8 million. There has been a slight reduction in the capital that's been made available to the portfolio, but again, we're expecting to be able to deliver everything that we've set out within the overall capital and resource allocations that have been made. But I do think it's also important to remember, I think, the number of pieces of work and efficiencies that have been undertaken and are still ongoing within the Marine Directorate itself. But again, I think just coming back to the initial point about the marine protection vessels, funding has been identified for that over the course of the next 4 years. OK, so that funding doesn't actually appear within the your portfolio, it appears somewhere else in the Scottish Government's budget? It wouldn't be within the allocations for this financial year, but it's in the spending review and identified in there. OK, thank you. Tim Eagle.
Yeah, thank you. Can I take you back, Cabinet Secretary, to a letter you probably won't remember, but you sent in December 24 on the back of the committee doing some work specifically around marine in terms of the budget at that point. One of the sort of biggest issues I have when I speak to fishermen up in the north of Scotland is, and something I've written to you about before, is this contradiction between the government who say things are going well out at sea in terms of catching and enforcement and monitoring of what's being caught out at sea, and fishermen that come to me and say, no, absolutely it's not. It's chaos out there. You know, there are ships being landed, particularly ships that are going directly to the EU, where we don't know what's on board. In that letter, you said that the budget would help develop a land-based inspection and analysis system focusing on vessels that fish our seas but do not land into a Scottish port. Have you got any update on how the budget this year is going to continue the development of that system, or if that's already been done?
I'll have to check. I don't know, Ian, if you would have any further information on that at the moment, but I mean, if not, I'm more than happy to follow up on that specific query in particular, because, sorry, I don't have that information or that letter to hand. But Ian, or is there anything else you can add to this
come in a bit in the point around non-UK and UK vessels. So every year we'll look at our operating model, we'll look at the intelligence we've had from the previous years. Looking at this year, we had data from over 80,000 voyages, which talks to that data set that we use to inform our operational activity. In the last year, in terms of boardings at sea, 1 in 6 UK vessels were boarded. We had 1 in 3 non-UK vessels boarded. In terms of non-UK vessels, and it comes to that point you're making on the data sharing, we've been working hard with coastal states for those vessels because they don't land in the UK, so we need to get more data and information on them. We've already got an agreement in place with Norway, so that's increased the amount of either assurance or actions we can then take, and we'll shortly have an agreement with the EU as well. So we continue to work hard in that space to make sure we're taking the right actions at the right times.
And can I just say that, where it says that land-based inspection and analysis system, is that what you mean by that then? It's this kind of multilateral response.
Our operating model cuts across what we do at sea, what we do from a data perspective. On land, last year we did 1,920 inspections at markets. That actually covered 70% of the sea fish that was coming through auction. So it's always about how we get the balance across those different areas and then target it effectively.
OK, thank you very much.
Thank you. Rhoda Grant.
You
Cabinet Secretary will be aware that we visited the Aberdeen laboratories as a committee, and it was pretty shocking, if I'm being honest about it, the state of repair, buildings not in use. The lecture theatre was full of freezers and fridges holding things. It was a pretty awful place to work, as well as very difficult to see how those that were kind of the scientists working there could work well. I'm wondering, what stage are we at for the redevelopment of the marine labs? Is there money in the budget for that? What's going to happen? Because it can't go on the way it is.
I agreed, and I remember that we discussed this in previous committee sessions as well, and I've been to the Aberdeen site myself and seen, so I completely understand the concerns that have been raised about that. What I would say is I'll turn to Ian, who can provide more of a detailed update, I think, in relation to some of the work that's been undertaken. But since 2020, there's been about £10 million that's been invested in the site, and I think there's been around 1.2 million, or just over that, that's been identified for work to take place. That's been over the course of this year and over next year too. There is a project board that is looking at, well, what needs to be done in the short term, medium term, and what are the longer term aspirations for the site. And I think they're working up a strategic outline case for that work. But again, just to say, you won't see an allocation for that or that utilised within the Marine Directorate budget, because this is part of the SG estate, so that would fall to the estates to fund that, and that's largely where the funding for this work has come from. But if it's helpful, I'll hand over to Ian, who can explain a bit more about some of the work that's taken place there.
Thank you, and happy to update and progress. So I think since committee were at Aberdeen, the first priority was to do site condition surveys, so we can get a sense of what needed to be done and any further actions that were required. As CABSEC mentioned, in this financial year there will be a £1.26 million spend, and we've already got £900,000 identified for next year. That's doing a mix of different things. So there's upgrades to essential equipment. So in the last year we've looked at our sonar tank room and upgraded that. There's some maintenance just on the stairwells and the general condition of the building that you've alluded to. We've done some work on that just to maintain and make that a better work environment and space. And the biggest piece of work that's underway, you mentioned the lecture theatre, which is building A in the complex. That work is about to commence, and that will restore the laboratory facilities that were underneath that lecture theatre as well, and that will finish in the next year as well. Longer term, we're still looking at, we've still got some lab space at Aberdeen University, so we want to bring that back on site. We're looking at options for that and starting to finalise them, which we expect to do that by the middle of this year. We're also looking at our space for our net riggers and trying to source space for them. And again, we're just finalising options there. And as Cabinet Secretary said, the wider future of Aberdeen Estate, we've done the scope and work on that strategic outline case to make sure we can then look at the actual campus in entirety and set a business case for that.
That feels to me almost like you're throwing good money after bad. It just felt like it needed to be rebuilt. And kind of patching it here and patching it there might not work. I mean, there was kind of different buildings in different places and in different states of repair. Where could we find the funding? Whereabout in the budget should we be looking to find the funding for that? And I'm kind of conscious of an election coming up. You know, I think we probably need to put into our report at the end of this session to the new committee to look at this, because if we're going to have world-class science, we can't have that taking place in a shed, which is basically what we have.
Some of the longer-term work we'll look more at that. It's not just a case of patch and fix and move. It's about, well, how are we delivering as an estate that's fit to deliver what we need and is fit for the future and sustainable in the longer term as well. I'll have to ask Ian, or I could potentially follow up with the committee in terms of the exact budget line that falls under, because I don't know if that specific work is identified at that level in the budget, again, just because that falls to another area. But again, I can follow up with the committee, or Ian, I don't know if you necessarily have that information.
No, happy to follow up on that. That's work we're doing with the States colleagues, so that's where we'd look in terms of that budgetary requirement.
If I recall, one of the criticisms of the Marine Directorate when we looked at we had our short inquiry was there was a lack of transparency. Now, I'm not suggesting that lack of transparency was deliberate, but it wasn't clear what funding was going into the Marine Directorate, where that was coming from. And I think this is an example where some really fundamental investments to allow the Marine Directorate to operate in a modern way effectively, we can't actually see that, and we're not actually sure where it sits within the government budget, what portfolio. I know you said it was capital spend, but it's very difficult for us to actually drill down and see what investment and commitment the Scottish Government does have to the Marine Directorate. And if I remember correctly, that was one of the comments we had when we did the piece of work as a committee some time ago. And that's not just capital spend; it also included some of the funding, revenue spend, staffing costs, and whatever. So there is a lack of transparency. And I'm not suggesting that's deliberate, but that's maybe something that needs to be reflected on.
Well, I think there's a few points in there. I think some of that transparency, it's like some of the other schemes that we were talking about previously. I think that the budget lines that we see as presented don't provide the level of detail, I think, that can make it difficult for people looking at the budget to identify what spend is going where. But I think we made that commitment last year in relation to some of the budget lines. Obviously, once the budget is hopefully agreed and passed, I think the business plans are being developed by the Marine Directorate at the moment as to how that's going to be allocated. So we'll be happy to follow up to provide that clearer picture if that's helpful for the committee. And I also appreciate the difficulty when you say that the budget lines are coming from other portfolios. Of course, that's with our control in terms of when you're analysing my own budget lines. But again, we can, there's no deliberate intention there, but I do think it's quite right, obviously, that funding is coming from SG Estates, because it's all part of the Scottish Government's functions. But again, we will follow up with that information so that it's made more clear to and obvious to the committee where they should be focusing or what lines they should be looking at to see where that spend is going.
Thank you. Beatrice Wishart.
Convener. Rhoda Grant rightly mentioned Scotland's world-class science, but the committee's heard from stakeholders that reductions in the marine science budget has reduced capacity and damaged the Marine Directorate's international reputation for science. So, given the real terms reduction of 1.7 million in the budget, how can we improve the situation?
I think I wouldn't agree in relation to the comment that's been made about the capacity and the reputation, because I think when you look at the work that, particularly in marine science, that's undertaken through the Directorate, we have 80 of our scientists. When you look at actually some of the negotiations that we've been through recently and what we've delivered for the industry, that's £540 million of fishing opportunities. And that's, so much of that work depends on the work that's undertaken by our scientists. As I say, there's 80 of our scientists. They work across, I think, 70 different ICES working group. And it's our scientists that actually lead on 20 different stock assessments within that as well, because I think our expertise and reputation is recognised in relation to that. Also, on the science spend, again, in the current financial year too, there was an increase in the overall spend on science of £1.2 million as well, because obviously we recognise how critical that is. There are a number of pieces of work that are happening in relation to our science work in the Marine Directorate. A couple of years ago now, we published our Science and Innovation Strategy. There's really setting out it's so vital that we work with our partners, and it's about how we can look to better collaborate, utilise other expertise. We have the Chief Scientific Advisor for Marine in place now. We have published an area of research interest paper this year, and the implementation plan for the Science and Innovation Strategy is due to be published this year too. So I think all of that shows that we are committed to investing in our science work and that we are delivering a lot of work in relation to that area.
Are you able to say how much science and research you buy in from other countries?
From other countries, I don't know that off the top of my head. And you mean in terms of collaboration and other people that we're working with?
Well, when the Marine Directorate can't provide what you're looking for in terms of research and data analysis, and you buy that in from elsewhere, are you able to say just how much of that takes place?
Again, I would have to follow up in relation to specific details, but I think there are a number of different collaborations that take place, whether that's with the industry themselves. We've undertaken work with masts as well. There's been a number of different papers that have been published over the course of the last year, but I think in terms of the specific details, we'd have to follow up with that in relation to some of those partnerships and some of the work that we've taken forward there. But that goes, but I mean, it is quite a broad area too, but I think hopefully that will emphasise to the committee the range of partnerships that take place. Or I don't know if there are any other specific examples that you can think of, Ian, that would be helpful here, or if we're just better following up in relation to that.
Plenty of collaboration has taken place across the board. Sometimes that's with industry, in terms of sea fisheries and our co-sampling. Yeah. It can be with masts and other organisations as well. So happy to provide a breakdown in terms of that. I think the collaboration in science is a key part of how we move forward. That, as Cabinet Secretary, is why we put out the areas of research interest, to be clear on what our research priorities were and what questions needed to be answered over the coming years to give us a good evidence base across the board there.
I can't speak about fishery science without saying how important UHI Shetland is in the mix. But thank you for that.
Thank you. Have you got further questions?
Not on this issue. I was looking at...
supplement. Alistair Allen, I think.
You've touched on some of these issues, but Marine Fund Scotland has had budget increased by £2.1 million. Can you say a bit more about how that money will be used, and particularly what the aims are, what the outcomes are that the Scottish Government's looking for from that uplift?
Yes, I mean, ultimately with the Marine Fund Scotland, we know how valuable that's been for industry and for coastal communities over the years that it's been in operation. And I think, just to give an idea, I think some of the demand that we've had for the Marine Fund Scotland over this past year, I think we had applications that would have totaled over £30 million in total when we had just over £14 million available. So we know that appetite is there for that capital and resource funding. We're constantly looking at the fund to see, well, you know, how is it operating? Is it delivering what we need? It's largely modelled on the blue economy outcomes that we'd set out. But I mean, again, we're currently looking at that at the moment to see what that looks like, or if there would be any potential changes for the coming year. But I think it has been a really valuable fund. And of course, we've included the uplift that would have come from the Fisheries and Coastal Growth Fund for the coming year as well, increasing the funding that's going to be available through Marine Fund Scotland this year. And
given that you've said that it's oversubscribed with applicants, what are the sort of criteria that are being used to prioritise that funding?
Again, some of our, I think maybe it's helpful to talk about some of the projects that we're funding through that. So we published our blue economy. I think that's been a few years ago now since we've done that. One key element of that is about how we support new entrants in the fishing industry. So there's, I think we funded vessels for fishermen, or paying the cost towards vessels for fishermen there. Some of that funding has gone to support some of our partners in the work that they do, whether it's Scottish Fishermen's Federation. There's funding for Seafood Scotland as well to help them deliver the programme of work that they do across Scotland, which has been really vital. And we allocated some funding towards that last year for the Ocean Clusters project as well. But again, I'm more than happy to follow up with some of the key projects to help outline and what some of the outcomes we're looking for are. I think a key point is also innovation, and also tackling some of the issues that we see around our coastline, whether that's tackling the issues with marine litter, but also really helping our marine industries innovate, tackle some of the challenges that we know exist at the moment. But I'm more than happy to follow up with more information on that.
Thank you, Convener.
Beatrice Wishart.
Cabinet Secretary, are you able to say anything in terms of Marine Fund about what this would mean for shellfish aquaculture?
Again, we haven't opened a new round this year, but I believe that we have had funding allocated for, or perhaps there's some projects. Again, I would have to look at the details of some of the projects that we funded in the past. But again, I mean, our shellfish industry is hugely important, and it's part of our vision for sustainable aquaculture in Scotland as well. So again, I think it's a key sector that we would look to engage with and support.
Thank you.
Once again, I'm going to refer to stakeholders' comments on the budget, and you touched on the Scottish Fishermen's Federation there. They have been strongly critical of the cuts to the marine budget, and have suggested that reduced funding for marine science and management jeopardises sound policy making, enforcement and sustainability at a time when demands in the marine environment are growing, and we hear on a regular basis about spatial pressures. You know, the SFF also notes the enormous increase in resources for offshore wind directorate. That's tripled in size, but the reduction in the marine budget undermines effective fisheries management and threatens to produce unintended consequences. So when we look at this budget, and we've just heard that there was a demand for £30 million worth of support, but only £14 million was forthcoming, are you confident that we can do everything we can do for our inshore and offshore fisheries to make sure they are sustainable, and again address the pressures that are currently on them to become more sustainable?
Well, again, I mean, I think just focusing on science, as I say, we had an increase to the science budget last year. But it's always going to be difficult. I think our marine area is so vast, which is why I think the work that we're taking forward through our science and innovation strategy is so important, and the work that Ian touched on in terms of the areas of research interest, because we recognise we have to collaborate with others in the development of this work and how we take that forward. I think our scientists already do incredible work. I've talked about some of the involvement through ICES, and we see the direct impact of that, because that all helps bring in the funding and the opportunities that we see through those through the coastal states negotiations, and bring those opportunities for our fishermen. But again, I think it's about how we best utilise the resource that we have. It's about working with others, because we have significant areas of expertise across Scotland. I recognise Beatrice Wishart's point about UHI Shetland, MAST, SAMS, all these different organisations that we want to collaborate with. So it's putting that into practice. I think the implementation work that's due to come forward this year in relation to that strategy is going to be really critical for that as well.
So there's no doubt we do have world-leading scientists who are doing a great job, but you know, it could be said that they've got a hand tied behind their back, and their capacity to develop or continue to have a reputation internationally for marine there is a barrier to that, and they're having to make priority choices. Should we be seeing an increase in the marine budget to make sure that, given the challenges they've got, they don't have a hand tied behind their back and they're going to have to pick and choose? And forgive me for mentioning the word cockles, but there's a great example of a fishery that there could be developed, but it's taken a long time because of capacity and resource implications, and I'm sure that's not the only fishery that could be developed. So are we seeing our scientists having one hand tied behind their back because of funding and resource challenges?
Again, we did increase that science resource last year, but I appreciate the point, and I do hope that at least you've seen the work that we are putting towards that, and I think in hopefully making some progress in relation to that, and trying to identify new opportunities for our fishermen as well. But I think it's overall important, you know, when you consider the Marine Directorate's budget, and it's like other parts across government as well, we're striving for efficiency while still trying to deliver on our overall objectives too. But there are savings that have been made within that, I think, because of some of the investments that have been made. And I think the Marine Directorate is a good example of looking at some of the new technology that's been utilised that actually costs us less overall, but is providing us with better data, better information, as I say, helping on those costs. So you look at some of the investment that we've made and that we've been taking forward in relation to the remotely piloted aircraft systems, being able to utilise that. That helps with our overall compliance, and it increases our capabilities out at sea as well. Of course, we'd had discussion previously about the aircraft that have been utilised, but we've entered into a contract in relation to that is saving us an awful lot of money while still maintaining that overall resource, which is so vital for our compliance. There's the investment that they've been making in remote electronic monitoring and in VMS as well. All of that helping with that wider data picture, which enables us to do more ultimately. So I think these investments that we've made, there'll be the continuing investments with the new marine vessels as well coming down the track. I think that ultimately can help us save money, which is a good thing. But of course, with science, we recognise how vital that is. But again, we had the increased resource to that last year. The business plans are being developed for this year. And as I've outlined previously, I'm happy to outline those more detail on those allocations once that's been finalised.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We now move on to the final key area of the budget, which is the Islands budget. A question from Rhoda Grant.
Thank you, Convener. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to explain in more detail the reduction of capital funding for the carbon neutral islands and the islands plan budgets, and what are the projections for these budgets going forward in light of the revised islands plan?
Yes, I'm happy to. So, of course, there has been an overall reduction in the capital funding that's been allocated to the Islands programme and the Carbon Neutral Islands programme. There has been an increase in resource that's been made to the Islands programme. So I think there's a 3.75 capital allocation for the Islands programme this year, as well as £2.5 million being available in resource. And that's an uplift in resource funding compared to what was in the budget for that last year. And there is only the resource funding available for the Carbon Neutral Islands project. So unfortunately, that just, I think, shows some of the difficult decisions that we've had to make across the portfolio in relation to capital spend through that. But ultimately, I think that will help continue to deliver. I think the pipeline of projects that have been developed over the course of the Islands programme, even though there's no specific capital identified against the Carbon Neutral Islands programme, it will of course be able to, if there were any specific projects coming through that could be accessed through the capital that's there for the Islands programme too. But I think in terms of the overall delivery of the National Islands plan, I think again, if you look through the narrow prism of my portfolio, well, I just think we need to look more broadly than that, because some of the key objectives that have been set out within the plan, well, the overarching objective is about population, how we retain populations in our island communities and increase populations. But a lot of that also comes down to some of the other key areas across government, the investment that's made through transport, the investment that's been made through housing, and then through in the budget that was announced last week, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance also touched on the Islands Accelerator project as well for our island authorities, which is about that capital investment and investing in things such as fixed links, which are also identified in the National Islands Plan too.
I would be keen to know what the practical implications are of that, because certainly with the Carbon Neutral Islands pilot, it was a pilot to kind of show the way forward about how we achieve being carbon neutral. And I don't know, given kind of funding cuts, are we close to kind of those islands becoming carbon neutral, or is this something that's just going to kind of fall by the wayside?
Oh, yeah, no, certainly not intending to, because I think that's where it's still being able to retain the resource funding has been an important element of that. And I think a lot of good work has been developed in relation to carbon neutral islands. We've funded the community development workers that are based on the islands involved, and I think they've been doing some incredible work, and of course we want to see that continue. So again, even though there isn't a specific capital allocation against that, that's not to prevent any projects coming through the Islands programme allocation as well. But I think I'm more than happy to follow up in terms of specifics and how the programme, what it's delivered and where we're the point we're at with it at the moment. But again, I think it has been a really positive programme of work that we want to see continue into the future.
That would be really useful, because one imagines an awful lot of the work coming out of that would require capital funding. If you're looking at community energy generation, if you're looking at insulation, if you're looking at all those changes that require to happen to be carbon neutral, it's hard to see how that can happen without capital allocations.
Financing, you're right, but I think part of the work that was being taken forward through that as well was looking at broader financing strategies too. So I think it has delivered some important projects, I think, through the capital funding that we've had available in previous years. But again, it's looking at where we can leave it in that extra funding and what more can be achieved. So yeah, but as I say, I'm more than happy to follow up with some of the specifics in relation to that.
Okay, thank you.
Leanne Burgess.
Just following up on Rhoda Grant's questions there. So I wonder if something you're getting at is where Carbon Neutral Island projects, the project officers can use their role to so one example I've seen is housing. Housing is an issue the retrofitting of housing on, I think it was Rossay. Is that where they would tap into money from another budget that's out with your portfolio? Is that what you're talking about, that they can actually access funds that sit in other Cabinet Secretaries' portfolios?
If that was identified as a priority, I think that, I mean, there are some elements, well, when you look at the funding that's available at the moment in relation to housing, and that I think has been set out in the broader housing documents, we have the Rural and Islands Housing Fund, we have the action plan on the back of that, which I think is really about looking at different models of delivery and what works in different parts of Scotland and how we can best utilise and encourage that. And I think the overall funding over the next few years of that is projected to increase to about £37 million. So I think wherever we can align these projects, I mean, they shouldn't and they wouldn't be happening in isolation. It's about how, ultimately, it's about how these other parts of government, and that's what the National Islands Plan is, are delivering for our islands community. And that's set out in some of the objectives that we have in the National Islands Plan, whether that's in relation to housing, but also in relation to transport and other areas too.
And then just so that's helpful. So in terms of the resource and the funding for the community development officers, a few years ago, that was they were coming to me and talking about how they were concerned, where they're going to get the money, and have we been able to, I know we can't necessarily do multi-year funding for them, but have we been able to get to a place where we can actually give them a kind of advance notice that it is coming, rather than worrying if they're going to be getting a job and can they pay their mortgage or whatever?
Anybody hanging in limbo when it's matters as serious as that. So I think, obviously, we've had the budget published now, of course, a bit later than I think anybody would have liked. But again, we want to give that security to people as early as possible. So I'm not too sure if it has been 100% been confirmed yet, but I will follow up and make sure that that is the case.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Allen.
I suppose just briefly to add to that, again, thinking of carbon neutral islands and the funding for that. Can you say a wee bit more about how this ties in potentially to other future areas of funding, whether it's revenue support for borrowing for local authorities or other longer term measures, or how you might mainstream, as it were, the projects that have been begun through the Carbon Neutral Islands project into the future?
Yes, well, I think it's through the work that's been undertaken so far, and I would say for the Islands programme more generally, I think because that work has been ongoing for a number of years with SFT, who've been leading that work and that engagement with local authorities, I think there has been quite a strong pipeline developed through that in relation to projects that have been coming through. And I do think the Islands Accelerator project as well, I think, offers quite an exciting opportunity for future models of funding to deliver that big capital infrastructure that could be so important for our islands as well. But for me, it's just really important that, again, we continue to build on the good work that has been done so far. And of course, we work with a number of different partners in relation to the Carbon Neutral Islands project in particular. There is access to other schemes as well. When you look at the Community and Renewable Energy Scheme, there's some of the area-based schemes as well that we can work with as appropriate in relation to that too. So I see it as very much we will continue to deliver on the good work that we believe has been started through the project.
Thank you, Convener.
Beatrice Wishart.
Convener, some of the funding announcements on islands this year falls under the remit of the Transport Secretary. So in terms of the draft National Islands plan, I wonder if you could say something around the measures and how these interact with the proposals for the draft Islands plan.
Absolutely. I mean, as I was mentioning to questions from Ariane Burgess, I think transport and housing are two of, I think, the most critical areas when it comes to delivering on the National Islands Plan objectives, because ultimately it's about that basic infrastructure if we want our people to remain on islands and people to come to our islands as well. So the investment that we're seeing through transport, I think, is going to be really critical to advancing the implementation of the new National Islands Plan, and it has improved connectivity as one of the strategic objectives within it. But I would say that the National Islands Plan, it doesn't replicate some of the other work that's already been published, such as the Islands Connectivity Plan plan, I think, as an example of that. It's about building on what's already been done. And I think there's been a number of different initiatives that have been announced in the budget. When you look at the removal of peak fares, the bus fare cap, I think some of the capital investment that's been made in some of our other islands as well, which will ultimately help to deliver on the objectives that have been set out.
One of the issues that's quite critical to any island is the freight and logistics of hauliers in getting goods in and out of the islands. Is there any reference to that in the draft islands plan?
Again, I would have to look through the detail just to double check. But I think we do recognise that, just how critical it is, as you say, making sure that there is, well, first of all, having that engagement with the operators too. And I know that my colleague in Transport and, of course, the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity as well are heavily involved in that work. So, yes, we recognise how vital that connectivity is. But again, I can follow up with the exact detail of that because I don't have the plan up in front of me. So I'd be reluctant to mention a specific objective or framing without having the specifics of the document there.
Thank you.
We've now got some supplementary questions. Ariane Burgess.
Oh, thanks, Convener. I didn't think you were coming to me first, but yep, sure. So I've got a question around, it's the budget line 109 in the level 4, it's food and drink, and it says, so there's no change, so there's an additional bit of money, but there's not much change, but I wanted to ask, so it says that budget line provides support for Scotland's food and drink policy and ministerial priorities, including funding for, and then it goes on to mention 3 points. So I just want to talk about, so point 2 is delivery of the Good Food Nation Act measures and establishment of the Scottish Food Commission, and point 3 is Good Food Nation local food policy priorities. And I just wanted to get a sense from you if you feel that there's sufficient funding in there, because we've got the draft plan that we've been looking at here, that's going to get published, and then once the draft plan comes, we're going to have local authorities, and I think in many cases some of them are already moving towards what they're going to be doing in their local plans. And I just wondered if you think there's anything we need to be looking at there in terms of making sure there is the right support. I think this is me with my local government hat on, making sure that there's the right support for local government, local authorities to actually start preparing the way for their plans.
And I appreciate the scrutiny that the Local Government Committee undertook on the Good Food Nation plan as well, and recognise, I think, the importance that was placed on that. And I think we discussed a lot at that time as well, the commencement of Section 10, which brings in the obligations on local authorities and health boards too. But I think what I would say in relation to the budget availability for the Good Food Nation, a lot of that focus in the budget and the funding that's there at the moment has and is being used for ensuring we've got the Food Commission up and running and fully established. So we have the commissioners in place now. We recently appointed the Chief Executive, who is now in post too. So that's where the funding focus has been in relation to that. But we are going to be having further conversations with local authorities, because as we discussed at the committee at that time when we were going through the scrutiny, I think there was some concern about the timing of the commencement of Section 10, because I think that the concern around the local government elections when the obligations would be brought into force. So again, those discussions are ongoing, but we had set out in the financial memorandum for the Good Food Nation Act the funding that we would expect to be making available to local authorities to assist in the development of their plans, because we recognise that will take some resource. But as I say, those discussions are still going to be ongoing.
Okay, and I've got another question. This is actually kind of curiosity question. So line 17 of the level 4 is rural cohesion, and it says that and there was a cut here. So rural cohesion budget funds projects and programs which build knowledge of, very small print, of and test approaches to rural development, addressing inequalities for people in rural communities. So I'd be interested to understand what are some of those projects, and if you don't have that on hand, maybe you could just write to the committee and flesh that out.
I'm happy to follow up. Now, I'm sure officials will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that there's also been a transfer of some of the budget that was in that line just to another budget line, and that was for the Scottish Rural Network, and that was really just to bring all the funding that's available for networking into the same place. But that the rural cohesion line has also provided funding it's our contribution as a portfolio to the Depopulation Action Plan, and we've been funding the community settlement officers there who have actually, that's been a really positive initiative that's been taking place. So that's where that funding has tended to be allocated to. But unless I'm corrected, and I'm more than happy to follow up with more detail if I'm wrong, I believe that that's where the decrease has come from. It's just an adjusting of that line and moving the funding elsewhere.
That would be helpful. I mean, I think it seems to me a really important pot. There's some other ones that we don't even get to in this committee, in the scrutiny of the budget, that seem really important around looking at the broader aspects of rural life and the challenges of living rurally. So, yeah, it would be good to hear more about that.
Because I think some of the budget lines as well, I don't think do justice to to what sits underneath them and what they actually fund. Because, well, I mentioned Scottish Rural Network there and the funding for that, which I think comes under technical assistance. I don't think you would necessarily look at the words technical assistance and associate that with the Scottish Rural Network. But again, I'm more than happy to provide more information as to some of these areas, the lines that sit underneath them and where that funding goes. Because I do think it's actually, we fund some really good initiatives, and I think it's really good to emphasise.
Yeah, and I think that also because of we had the Act, ARC Act, is the Agriculture and Rural Communities Act. And I think in that space we could have maybe on a side, we recognise that there's more to our rural communities than agriculture, and I think it's important that we as a committee don't that we keep that in view. Actually, yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to a question about the removal of the small business bonus relief for deer forests. This sounds like a family farm tax, Labour-esque, back of the fag packet policy. Were you made aware of the decision to remove the relief before it was announced?
First of all, we disagree with that assessment of it. And again, I think for those of us that took part in the Land Reform Bill and the Land Reform Act, as it now is. Now, of course, there were amendments that had been put forward by Ross Greer in relation to that, but of course there were some areas that needed to be worked out. But I think it had been a commitment that had been made with the government and the Green Party, and I think that discussion had been ongoing for a number of years. And then, of course, it was announced in the budget last week. But I think it's really important to point out, I think, some of the critical details there. So, of course, it sets out that shootings in deer forests are going to be excluded from eligibility for the small business bonus scheme relief and that Fresh Start relief, but there are exceptions within that as well. And that includes shooting rights are exercised solely for purposes of deer management, including to prevent damage to woodland or to agricultural production, environmental management or vermin control, crofts, and all forms of agricultural and small landholding tenancies, leases for new entrants and leases agreed for environmental purposes too. But of course, all of this is still going through its scrutiny at the moment. But again, I think it's important to highlight some of those exceptions that are there.
Were you made aware that this was going to be part of the budget?
Again, I knew it was an active discussion and a commitment we made as a government for a number of years. So that element of it wasn't a particular surprise. So
you didn't feed in any discussions with the Finance Secretary raising any concerns?
Well, again, we were in discussions about this through the course of the Land Reform Bill, because I think there'd been a number of pieces of work that had been undertaken. Again, I would have to go back and look at the exact ins and outs of that. But of course, there was close working between the portfolios in relation to the response to the amendments through that legislation, through the engagement that took place, because of course we wanted to make sure that any exemptions or any changes to the relief wouldn't harm any agriculture, any family farms or crofts, because that's not the intention of the changes that have been made to the scheme.
Well, I think a few of the committee members will have received correspondence from stakeholders. One, I could kick off with a message from the associated deer management groups, who are shocked and angered by the decision. And whilst they received weak assurances that deer management incentives are being considered and that deer management practitioners are valued, the removal of SBSS is likely to severely threaten the ability for volunteer collaborative deer management to deliver the outcomes that the Natural Environment Bill sets out. How do you give stakeholders reassurance that they will be able to continue, they'll be able to afford to continue, and it will deliver on the outcomes hoped for?
That's the thing. I mean, because of course we wouldn't want to undermine, I think, any of the work that's been done or any of the work that is actually currently being discussed through the amendments that have been taken forward through the Natural Environment Bill, which of course we'll be discussing in more detail in the coming weeks. Now, I think there will be more engagement on this, of course, because to hear the concerns or the frustrations that have been expressed by various stakeholders, I'm presuming that there would be guidance in relation to this as well to clarify what exemptions would be in place or not. So I still think that there are more discussions to take place in relation to this, because ultimately I think we all want to take a pragmatic approach to it.
Okay, thank you. Tim Eagle.
Slightly confused. We've been talking about deer management in Scotland now for months in the context of the Natural Environment Bill, and these are one and the same people. You know, it's one and the same group. So the people that are carrying often might have small shoops or syndicates or operate killing deer and selling a small bit of venison are the same people that are carrying out that deer management. So do you recognise the letters that you would have already received and some of the information coming out from groups like SLE, the Association of Deer Management Groups, BASC, etc.? Do you recognise the serious concerns of this policy being dropped into the budget?
Again, I completely recognise that. I mean, of course, we've heard that in some of the concerns that have been expressed. But as I say, there are exceptions there. I think there is still more work to be done. And of course, this is still working its way through Parliament at the moment as well. But we need to have those further discussions. But I think we've always been clear, and it was clear through the Land Reform Bill as well. And I think that I set that out to Parliament, that this is an area that I know that has been under consideration for some time, but we wouldn't be wanting to take an approach that either undermines the work that we've been doing or would have an impact on family farms or crofts in Scotland. And I think that's where we've got to make sure that we get this right.
So I think you have undermined that approach. I think you didn't consult at all with any stakeholders. You knew yourself. Obviously, the Cabinet Secretary for Finance was aware of this. You didn't consult at all with any groups, despite the fact that all of those groups have been widely consulted with in terms of the Natural Environment Bill. You dropped it into a budget. Now everybody is suddenly, it's a bit like, is this all forestry all over again? When that massive cut happened to forestry a few years ago and the whole sector went, blimey, here we go again. And this is what's happening with deer management. You've asked the whole sector to do a huge amount of deer management so that we can achieve our objectives in the climate change plan and other things. And suddenly you drop this in, and it's going to have an effect. I've got a few examples here. I've got a small producer in Highlands emailed me the other day, just got one deer forest, just sells venison locally, everything we want. Jim Fairley was in here a couple of weeks ago talking about how we should all be really proactive about venison sales. £1,000 they're now going to be left with. Not sure if they can continue. Winston Churchill Venison, that's an interesting name, kills 1,000 deer a year. This is in Argyll and Bute, sells venison locally, now is going to have to lay off staff. So there's jobs in the rural economy that are going. James Urquhart, remote Sutherland, deer shooting again, tries to bring people as a tourism into the area, £3,800 they're now going to have to pay. This is going to have a significant impact on rural Scotland, but more importantly, it is going to undermine the deer management that you're hoping to get in the Natural Environment Bill.
Again, I think in terms of those specific examples, if you want to write to myself or the Minister to highlight those, more than happy to do that. Of course, as I say, there is going to be that ongoing engagement and those discussions will continue.
So you think, so you think with that engagement, there is the scope to change this and put in, widen it so that more people are still eligible for the Small Business Bonus Scheme?
Again, I can't make that commitment at this stage because there are a number of exceptions that already exist there. I think any guidance that's put forward in relation to this, which I presume there would be, but I would have to check with finance colleagues in relation to the approach that's going to be taken on it. But I presume that there is still a bit of work to be done there. So I can't sit here today and commit that there are going to be any changes because there needs to be clarity on the exceptions and what exists there at the moment. But of course, ultimately, we wouldn't want to undermine the objectives that we're trying to achieve with your deer management.
I think you have undermined them. Just with hindsight, do you think it was a bit of a mistake to put this in the budget in the way that you've done that without doing all of this discussion with the sector before now?
Again, it has been under consideration for a number of years, and there were discussions and commitments made during the passage of the Land Reform Act as well in the Scottish Parliament, where we discussed when any changes could potentially be brought into force and what discussions would be taking place.
Okay. I've got one other question, but not on this, so if anybody else wants to come in on this.
Go ahead.
Just one other area, if that's all right, Cabinet Secretary. It's one thing, actually, I think we possibly do agree on, is around new entrants and the importance of young people to the rural economy. I think it's such an important question, personally, because I think when we look at agriculture in terms of developing new farm tenancies, or we talk about getting people into that sector, we talk about fishing and how people can either work on the boats or take on boats themselves. Forestry, I think, even in what we talked about earlier on around skill shortages around forestry and what we need to do with that, and even in terms of island repopulation and the importance of keeping young people in rural areas. Can you just set out a sort of bigger picture of how you feel the budget that's gone through this year for the wider rural economy portfolio will really support and help young people in our rural Scotland?
Well, I think there are a number of different areas within the budget where I think we're showing our commitment to that. I mean, first of all, I would say that in relation to when we consider the agriculture side and the importance of new entrants in the next generation, I mean, out with the budget at the moment, but I mean, we've been undertaken and had a number of different sessions with the next generation and new entrants to farming to find out and have those discussions about what support is actually needed, what is going to be most beneficial. That's why we've made commitments about the number of new opportunities that we're going to provide on public land. We have the specific funding for new entrants and next generation, which, as I touched on earlier, sits within the business development line within the budget, but that has gone towards things such as the practical training funds. But of course, there are a number of other things that I know people would like to see in initiatives that we are currently investigating to see what more can be done on the back of the feedback that we've had too. And I think across our fishing industry and our marine industries more broadly, I think that's where the Marine Fund Scotland has been so hugely important. We do have additional investment in that this year. We want to see new entrants to the industry as well. We want to invest in that safety and that training as well, which we have done in previous years too. So I think we have a strong package in relation to the support that we are delivering through the budget, extra elements that we have built on from previous years that I hope will send that strong signal of commitment and investment in the sectors.
Okay, I think that's what I wanted to hear. I was acutely conscious that during the Highland Show this year at the NFUS's political event, somebody from the New Entrant Forum asked a question on, and it was not about so much we talk and we talk and we talk, but actually what is the action? And I think that is something that I would encourage everybody that's sitting next to you today, that in each of those portfolios, we really look at those practical, really on-the-ground practical examples of how we can help young people to stay in rural Scotland and to work hard. And that is something, obviously, from what you've just said, that you believe in as well. Okay, fine.
Thank you very much. We have no further questions, so thank you, Cabinet Secretary and your officials for your time this morning. I now suspend the meeting to allow for a changeover of witnesses and a 5-minute comfort break. We'll reconvene at 11:25. Thank you. I suspend the meeting. Welcome back, and we now move on to our next item on the agenda, which is consideration of the draft Animal Health Fixed Penalty Notice Scotland Regulation 2026. And I welcome to the meeting Jim Fairley, the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity, and his officials. We have Policy Manager Caroline Blair, Solicitor for Rural Affairs Megan O'Brien, and the Policy Lead Ailey Wallace. And I invite the Minister to make a short opening statement.
Thank you, Committee. I'm very pleased to be here before the Committee to discuss the Animal Health Fixed Penalty Notices Scotland Regulations 2026. Now, these regulations introduce a new enforcement tool for the relevant enforcement bodies to address specific breaches of animal health and bee health legislation. Under these regulations, fixed penalty notices, or FPNs, are financial penalties that may be offered to a person believed to have committed a relevant offence under the Animal Health Act 1981 or the Bees Act 1980 by breaching a relevant requirement. Now, they're intended as an alternative to referring the case to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service for consideration of a criminal prosecution under the relevant legislation. Now, we acknowledge that FPNs will not be appropriate in all circumstances, particularly where there has been a repeat offending or a more serious breach of animal or bee health requirements. We have therefore consulted on and given careful consideration to the relevant requirements that have been included in the regulations. The intention is that the FPNs will be issued by an authorised officer in circumstances which may not permit prosecution, but where enforcement action should still be taken in order to protect animal or bee health. It's important to note that the regulations introduce a power for authorised officers to issue an FPN where relevant requirements are believed to have been breached, but there is no obligation on the officers to do so. Instead, the authorised officer will be able to decide whether to issue an FPN in each case or whether other enforcement action may be more appropriate. For example, there may be circumstances where the officer considers that verbal advice or written warning is likely to be sufficient to resolve the issue. FPNs will therefore complement existing enforcement options rather than replacing them, and prosecution will remain an option for more serious or repeated offending. There are several reasons why we are introducing FPNs. They provide a proportionate enforcement tool, ensuring that enforcement action is fair and balanced. They allow for quicker resolution of cases, reducing the burden on enforcement agencies and courts if a case was taken forward for prosecution. They encourage compliance without imposing the stigma or resource demands of a criminal conviction. They also have the potential to act as an additional deterrent in support of enforcement bodies to correct or encourage compliance with regulations more quickly. And finally, they help to maintain consistency and fairness by offering a clear and structured alternative to prosecution. In short, FPNs strengthen the enforcement framework by providing an additional flexible option that supports compliance while preserving the ability to take stronger action where it is necessary. The regulations set out in the framework for how FPNs will operate. They identify the authorities empowered to issue FPNs and explain the process for issuing them, as well as the circumstances in which an FPN cannot be issued. They detail how an FPN can be paid and the effect of payment, the process for appealing or withdrawing a notice, and the procedure for notifying an intention not to pay. They specify the relevant requirements and offences in relation to which an FPN can be issued, and the relevant penalty levels and amounts and circumstances in which a penalty amount could be increased or decreased. In addition, the regulations create an offence of obstructing an authorised officer exercising functions in relation to FPNs. They also amend the Health Act 1981 and the Bees Act 1980 to exclude the payment period for an FPN from the time limit for bringing criminal proceedings for an offence. So I'd welcome the opportunity to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you very much, Minister. Can I just put on record that it's not in the papers, but the DPLR committee considered this instrument yesterday and it agreed it had no recommendations to make. I've got a question from Tim Eagle.
Thank you. Good morning, Minister. I don't actually have a particularly big problem with this, but I just wanted to clarify a couple of things, if that's all right. One, just around the consultation. Obviously, there's quite a lot of groups. There was a lot of individuals that responded that we don't know, but of the groups that responded, a lot of those were around welfare. Are you comfortable that the consultation around this reached sort of all the sectors that this would implicate?
Well, this is a health issue rather than a welfare, and it should be clear that the two things are legislated for separately. So this is a health SSI, it's in direct relation to health issues rather than welfare issues. So I put that on the record because the fact you've said welfare as opposed to health. So I just want
Although I say that because that comes up in the consultation response. But yes.
Yes.
But anyway, are you happy?
Yes,
with
I am confident that the response that we had. I get there were some responses that were not entirely supportive. We don't have all the details as to why some people were not supportive of them. We can hazard a guess as to why some people weren't supportive. But yes, I'm confident that we've done the required work to make sure that we've got this proportionate FPN legislation in front of you today.
Okay, because it does say several respondents disagreed with FPN's, some commenting that the introduction of FPN process for bringing in enforcement routes that would be better dealt with by education. But you've tried that, haven't you? So this is about that next measure, if necessary.
Well, I would always expect education to be the first port of call. So if somebody goes onto a farm, for instance, and there are issues that are health related, the first thing that should happen is a conversation. Their ability to be able to issue the FPN is that additional tool in the box. But I would expect that would only be used on the basis where they don't feel they're going to get the required response in relation to somebody being asked to do something as a result of having that conversation, that education piece, if you want to call it that. But the FPN is there so that if somebody turns up on a farm and says, you haven't done this, it would really be better if you do something, not interested, well, we will issue you an FPN.
Fine. Okay, I'm happy. Thanks.
Ariane Burgess.
Wiener. Good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, so I'm supportive of this SSI, but I've just got a number of questions that I'd like to run through with you. So on the deterrence and proportionality part, do you consider that these penalty levels are sufficiently dissuasive for the kind of bad operators? Will you do you intend to review and uprate them over time?
In terms of the proportionality, yes, I think they are. Because by and large, people don't want to commit crime. They don't want to do things that are wrong. There may be, there are any number of circumstances where people might get themselves into a difficult position because they haven't done something because they've either run out of time or there are other things going on in their lives. So the proportionality is about saying, look, we can impose this fine on you. We can impose this fixed penalty notice on you. I believe that they are proportionate. I believe that they are in line with what it is that the expectation would be. If there is consistent and then repeat offending, that's a different conversation. But what we have at the moment is just that extra tool in the box to be able to say to people, this can be issued to you if you do not comply. And I believe that will probably, if they get it once, that will be more than enough because they'll have money to pay out of their pocket, which they don't want to do. But I would hope that by and large what we'll get to is a position where people actually just get on with doing the things that they need to do rather than have to get the fixed penalty notice in the first place.
And in terms of the uprating, is there an intention to uprate it over time?
Well, we will review that as we go along. I mean, is there anything specifically where we are at the moment where we're going to say we're going to look at it? But the fact that we have the power, if we get this SSI passed, the fact that we'd have the power would then be a decision to be taken 2, 5, 10 years' time, depending on what the circumstances are at that moment in time.
Okay. My next question is around the early payment discounts, and I'd be interested to understand why you think there needs to be an early payment discount and whether you would consider removing it or at least tightening the terms on it.
Okay, could I return the question? Do you have a concern about the early payment discount?
So the concerns are that discounting could undermine the deterrence and create a perception that breaches can be resolved quickly and quietly.
Okay, I can see the point, but as I said right at the start of this session, I would hope that what we do is we get to a position where people don't actually accept the fixed penalty notice because they resolve the issue that they have in the first place. So if there is an option to get that early payment, and that's like, okay, right, I've crossed the line, I'm going to get that early payment, I'll get it done, but I'm not going to allow this to happen again. This isn't about prosecuting people for the sake of getting people to catch people. It's about making sure we've got the ability to be able to have these negotiations with people saying, look, this is the situation, this is the law, this is what you have to comply with, we're giving you every opportunity to do so, do that and we'll be fine. but there has to be something there to be able to have that conversation.
Okay, great, thanks. I think I get the point that this is the tool and it's a deterrent. That's what you're trying to do, but I just want to, I've got a couple more questions. So this one is around the discretion to extend the payment period. So I'd be interested to understand what criteria will govern extensions and how consistency would be ensured.
I'm going to turn to Ailey for that one.
It would be taken on a case-by-case basis. We'll put some information into the enforcement guidance that we're developing for enforcement agencies, but it would really be for the enforcement agencies themselves to determine whether or not it was appropriate at the time. It could, for example, be for family reasons, if there are exceptional circumstances that suggest that extending the payment period might be necessary. We would just have to take it on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, all right. I just think the point there is that there's a sense that 28 days is a reasonable amount of time, and to kind of extend that, 28 days, that's almost a month. Just, anyway, good to hear.
If you're lambing and calving and you haven't made that payment and you're in the guts of it.
Yes,
so there will be circumstances where people just physically can't get to do something.
Okay, great. Thanks for clarifying that. Now, this one is around transparency and oversight. So I'd like to understand if the Scottish Government would be willing to, the Scottish Government would be willing to commit to annual publications of the headline data that you'd be gathering from this. So that would include like the number of notices issued, whether they're paid, withdrawn, appealed. So it's kind of like getting that clarity of what you're saying, that actually it never even gets there because we're not getting any of these.
I know that we can. I don't know what the details are. So how would we actually do that?
So we have the ability under the Animal Health Act, section 81 of the Animal Health Act, to request the information from enforcement agencies to gather that data. And we do intend to publish that. We already publish enforcements and proceedings under section 80 of the Animal Health Act. So we'll just expand that to cover the FPNs that have been issued.
Okay, that's very helpful. I think what I'm looking for here is reassurance that the FPNs won't be used as a substitute for the prosecution in cases that are serious, deliberate or repeated. So that would be great to have that data. Okay, thanks, Convener.
I've just got a very quick question. It's around the appeal of FPNs. Currently, the appeals are reviewed by the body that issued the fixed penalty notice, and that's the relevant enforcement authority. So that could be the Scottish ministers or the inspectors they appoint, local authorities, police or authorised persons under the Bees Act. There is an argument that there should be an appeals process which doesn't include the body that originally decided upon whether to deliver a fixed penalty notice. Is that something that might be up for review as part of the review process in the future?
I think what we're currently looking at is that the issuing authority is the person who would issue the fixed penalty notice, and that's the person that you'd also appeal to. But it would be a different person. It wouldn't be the same person. So if a person has gone out onto a farm or to a hive, issued a fixed penalty notice, and the person who has received that fixed penalty notice wants to appeal to it, they will go back to the same authorising body, but it would be a different person who would actually look at the offence to see whether or not it was a justifiable FPN or not.
Okay, thanks, Minister. I don't believe there's any further questions. We now move on to agenda item 4, which is the formal consideration of the motion to approve the instrument and invite the Minister to speak to and move motion S6M 20214.
Moved.
Thank you, Minister. Does any member wish to debate the motion? No member. Thank you. Is the committee content to recommend approval of this instrument? We are content. And finally, is the committee content to delegate authority to me to sign off a report on the instrument? Thank you. We are content. So that completes our consideration of the instrument, and that concludes our business in public. And we'll now move into private session, and I suspend this meeting for 2 minutes. Thank you.